He did not come to this town to be forgiven. He came to disappear. Every evening, as the sun lowered itself behind the trees, a retired Navy SEAL walked the same forest trail with a war dog who never stopped watching. An old woman sat on the same bench each day, feeding birds, never asking his name, never asking his past. It looked like coincidence. It was not. One afternoon, the bench was empty. No birds. No old woman. What Mason discovered next would force him to face the one truth he had spent years running from. That he was alive because someone else chose not to be.
He's hit, I need help!
And sometimes the miracle is not survival. It is being brave enough to carry the meaning forward. The town sat where the forest began to thin, as if the trees themselves had decided not to press any farther. It was late autumn, the kind that carried cold without announcing winter, and the air smelled faintly of pine sap and damp earth. A gray sky hung low over the rooftops, not threatening rain, only weight. Wind moved through the streets in careful breaths, lifting leaves from gutters and setting them back down again as though unsure where they belonged. This was not a town that tried to impress newcomers. It existed quietly, the way some people did after they had learned not to expect applause. Mason Hale arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. He chose the town the way one chooses silence, not because it promised peace, but because it promised nothing at all. Mason was in his early 40s, tall without being imposing, his frame lean in the way of someone who had once been sharpened by discipline and now carried that shape without effort. His hair, dark brown threaded with early gray, was kept short by habit rather than vanity. His face bore the subtle marks of injury and weather, a faint scar near the jawline, a permanent tension around the eyes that suggested vigilance long after it was required. He wore practical clothing, boots worn thin at the heel, jeans softened by years of use, a jacket that had seen more mornings than evenings. He moved with economy, each step measured, as if the ground itself were something to negotiate rather than trust. Mason did not look like a man hiding, but he carried the posture of someone who had learned that visibility invited consequence. People in town noticed him in the way they noticed weather, briefly, without comment. He rented a small house on the edge of town where the pavement gave up and dirt roads took over. The house was modest, wood-framed, with a porch that creaked under honest weight. He unpacked efficiently, as though the act itself were a task to be completed rather than a beginning to be celebrated. There were few personal items, fewer decorations, a life pared down to what could be carried without memory protesting too loudly. Briggs followed him everywhere from the first moment the door opened. The German shepherd was large, broad-chested, his black and tan coat dulled slightly by age, but still thick and weather-resistant. He moved with the quiet authority of an animal who had learned when to be alert and when not to waste energy. His eyes were amber-brown, intelligent and watchful, with the kind of calm that came not from innocence, but from experience. Briggs was older now, past the frantic energy of youth, but there was nothing fragile about him. He wore a simple harness, dark and unadorned, free of insignia. There were no medals on display, no markers of what he had been trained to do. His loyalty was not demonstrative. He did not jump or bark unnecessarily. Instead, he stayed close to Mason's left side, close enough to brush against him when the terrain narrowed, close enough to feel without crowding. Briggs had learned his human the way soldiers learned each other, by observation, by silence, by surviving the same moments. By the time the first evening settled, the sky began to change color in slow, deliberate layers. Gray softened into pale gold, then into something warmer, almost forgiving. Mason stepped outside with Briggs just as the light began to lower itself behind the tree line. He had not planned the walk. It simply happened, the way habits do when they replace intention. The path began near the back of the property, a narrow wooden trail built to keep feet from sinking into mud when the rains came. It led toward the forest and curved gently along its edge, never fully committing to the dark between the trees. Mason walked as if he were testing the world, one step at a time. His breathing was shallow, something he did not notice because it had been that way for years. Briggs matched his pace without looking at him, ears swiveling occasionally toward distant sounds, branches shifting, a bird settling for the night, the subtle crack of something small moving through underbrush. The forest did not feel threatening, but it was not gentle either. It existed with the indifference of something that would outlast regret. As they moved farther along the trail, Mason felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the kind that arrived without warning and left without explanation. The rhythm of walking helped, but it did not solve anything. He had not come here to be fixed. He had come because the noise elsewhere had grown too loud. Cities remembered too much. People asked questions with their faces even when their mouths stayed closed. Here, the trees did not ask who he had been or why he now chose to disappear at the edge of daylight. The sun lowered another degree, and the world softened. Dusk was a threshold Mason understood. It was not day, not night, and therefore demanded nothing. He found himself walking farther than intended, the boards beneath his boots creaking in steady intervals. Briggs slowed once, just slightly, then resumed pace. Mason did not notice the adjustment, only that his own stride evened out, as if guided. The trail widened near a clearing where the forest pulled back enough to allow the sky some space. A simple wooden bench sat off to one side, empty now. Mason glanced at it without interest. He did not stop. The bench was not an invitation, it was merely evidence that someone else had once needed rest there. The air cooled quickly, and Mason felt it settle into his joints, a reminder of older injuries that had never fully forgiven him. He rolled his shoulders once, a habitual motion, and kept walking. Briggs stayed close, the tip of his tail brushing Mason's leg in a steady rhythm. There was comfort in that contact, not warmth exactly, but confirmation, something solid, something real. By the time they turned back toward the house, the sky had deepened into blue, and the first lights in town flickered on. Mason felt the day release its grip, not violently, but with a reluctant loosening. He did not feel better. He felt less surrounded. That was enough. When they reached the porch again, Mason paused before opening the door. He stood there, listening to the forest breathe behind him, the town settling into itself ahead. Briggs sat without being told, eyes forward, posture alert but relaxed. For a moment, neither of them moved. The day ended not with relief, but with a quiet understanding. Tomorrow would arrive whether Mason invited it or not. He opened the door. The house accepted them without comment. Outside, the forest darkened, patient and waiting. Inside, Mason removed his jacket and hung it carefully, as though order itself were something worth preserving. Briggs lay down near the door, head on his paws, eyes half closed but attentive. The man who walked at dusk did not know yet what the path would ask of him. He only knew that when the sun lowered its guard, the world asked less of his breath. For now, that was enough to keep walking. The morning arrived without ceremony. A thin veil of mist clung to the edges of the town, softening rooftops and telephone wires, as if the world had decided to speak more quietly for a few hours. The forest beyond the last row of houses exhaled a damp, resinous scent, carried inward by a slow-moving breeze. The weather was neither warm nor cold, suspended somewhere in between, and Mason Hale found himself appreciating that uncertainty. Extremes demanded reaction. This did not. Mason woke before the sun fully cleared the trees. He always did. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and alert, a habit formed long before the town, long before the forest. He lay still for a moment, listening, not for danger, but for confirmation. The house made its small sounds, wood settling, pipes cooling, the distant caw of a bird that had mistaken dawn for something urgent. Mason rose without hesitation. He was tall, his movements economical, his posture naturally guarded, even in solitude. Time had softened none of that. It had only made it quieter. Briggs lifted his head as Mason swung his legs over the side of the bed. The German shepherd was already awake, as he always was, his body curled but not slack, muscles ready beneath his coat. In the light filtering through the window, Briggs's fur showed its age more clearly. Black along the back, dulled to charcoal, tan along the legs, dusted with gray. His eyes, still sharp, followed Mason with practiced attention. Briggs was older now, past the years of rapid response and relentless drive, but he carried himself with the confidence of an animal that had once been given purpose and had not forgotten what that felt like. He did not rush Mason. He waited, a discipline learned through repetition and trust. They moved through the morning without speaking, a ritual that did not require language. Mason brewed coffee strong enough to taste like intention. Briggs drank water, then returned to his spot near the door, where he could observe the world through a narrow window. Mason noticed how the dog positioned himself, not blocking the exit, not crowding it either, simply present. It was the same posture Briggs had always taken, ready but not restless. The forest waited until evening to make itself known again. When dusk came, it arrived gently, as it had the night before, pulling color from the sky in slow increments. Mason put on his jacket and reached for the leash more out of courtesy than necessity. Briggs accepted it calmly, tail giving one measured sweep. Outside, the town receded almost immediately, its sounds thinning as the path toward the trees took over. The trail greeted them with familiarity that felt unearned. The wooden boards were cool underfoot, darkened by moisture, each plank holding the memory of rain. The forest rose beside them, tall and indifferent, trunks standing like witnesses who had seen enough to stop reacting. Mason felt his shoulders drop a fraction as they walked. He did not notice the change until it had already happened. His breath, usually clipped and shallow, began to lengthen without instruction. The forest did not ask Mason who he was. It did not care what he had carried into it or what he hoped to leave behind. Wind moved through branches overhead, producing a sound that was not silence but close enough. Leaves shifted beneath unseen animals. Somewhere deeper in the trees, something snapped, a branch perhaps, or the careless step of a deer. Mason's body reacted before his mind did, muscles tightening, attention sharpening. For a moment, the forest was no longer neutral. It became something else, something remembered. The sound echoed too closely to another place, another time. The cadence of it, irregular, abrupt, matched a memory Mason did not summon intentionally. He stopped walking without realizing it. Briggs halted instantly, turning his head just enough to look back at him. The dog did not tense. He did not bark. He simply waited, assessing Mason rather than the forest. Mason forced his gaze away from the deeper shadows between the trees. He focused instead on the trail, on the pattern of wood beneath his boots, on the weight of the leash in his hand. He inhaled, then exhaled, the motion stiff at first, then marginally smoother. The forest did not advance. It did not retreat either. It remained what it was, a place that existed regardless of his internal negotiations. They continued. Each step carried them farther from town, though never fully into wilderness. The path curved gently, as if unwilling to surprise anyone. Mason noticed details he had missed the night before, moss growing thick along the edges of fallen logs, the way ivy clung to stone without appearing desperate, the subtle gradation of green that made the forest feel layered rather than dense. There was order here, but not the kind enforced by rules or commands. It was an order that emerged from time. Briggs walked slightly ahead now, his pace unhurried but deliberate. His ears moved independently, tracking sounds Mason could not place. The dog's presence anchored the moment. Mason had learned long ago that Briggs reacted not to fear, but to reality. If the dog was calm, the situation was manageable. Mason trusted that logic more than his own instincts, which had a habit of mistaking memory for threat. As they moved, Mason became aware of his breath again, not because it caught, but because it steadied. Each inhale drew in air, cool enough to register. Each exhale left his chest with less resistance than usual. The forest did not heal him. It did not erase what had happened. But it allowed a pause, a margin of space where the past could exist without dominating the present. The sound returned once more, a rustle, closer this time. Mason's spine stiffened reflexively. He stopped. Briggs stopped. The forest held its breath. Then a shape emerged from the undergrowth, a deer, slender and unafraid, eyes reflecting the last of the light. It watched them for a moment, assessing, then stepped away, disappearing with a grace that felt intentional. Mason released a breath he had not known he was holding. The tension drained, slow and reluctant. They reached the wider section of the trail, where the trees parted just enough to let the sky through. The bench stood there again, unoccupied, its wood weathered but intact. Mason slowed, then stopped beside it. He did not sit. He simply stood, looking out at the thinning light. Briggs lowered himself to the ground, settling at Mason's feet with a soft huff, his body curved but alert. Mason noticed then how quiet it felt inside his chest. Not empty, just quieter. The forest had done nothing remarkable. It had not spoken. It had not offered comfort. It had simply existed, and in doing so had allowed Mason to exist beside it without explanation. When they turned back toward town, darkness had begun to gather between the trees. The path seemed narrower now, though Mason knew it was unchanged. The difference was not in the forest. It was in him. His steps felt less urgent. His breath remained steady. Briggs stayed close, matching pace without direction. By the time the first lights of town came into view again, Mason felt the familiar boundary return, the line between where the forest ended and where people resumed their claims on space and sound. He did not resent it. He simply noted it. The walk had not fixed anything. It had not solved the problem of memory, or guilt, or survival. But it had given him something else, a place where his breath did not feel like borrowed time. At the porch, Mason paused as he had the night before. Briggs sat, the forest behind them darkened completely, patient and unchanged. Mason opened the door, carrying the quiet with him inside. Tomorrow, the forest would still be there. It did not need him, and somehow that made it easier to return. The afternoon carried a soft chill that belonged to early winter but had not yet committed to it. Clouds moved slowly above the town, stretched thin like wool pulled too far, letting pale light leak through in uneven patches. The streets near the forest edge were quiet, not empty, but subdued, as if the town understood that the day was winding down and chose not to interfere. Mason Hale stepped onto the trail with Briggs just as the light began its familiar descent, that unspoken signal that the world was about to ask less of him. Mason's appearance had not changed since his arrival, but the town had begun to register him in small ways. He was still the tall, broad-shouldered man who walked with a deliberate economy of movement, still dressed in practical layers that suggested readiness rather than comfort. His face, marked by restraint more than expression, carried the same guarded calm that had followed him since leaving his previous life behind. If there was any difference, it lived in the margins. The way his shoulders loosened slightly when he reached the trail, the way his breath no longer fought him quite as hard once the trees came into view. These were not changes anyone else would notice. Mason himself barely did. Briggs moved beside him with the unhurried confidence of an animal who understood routine and respected it. The German shepherd's gait was steady, his posture relaxed but attentive, his tail low and controlled. Age had softened his edges without dulling his awareness. His coat, thick and weathered, caught bits of light between branches, revealing gray threaded through the black along his spine. Briggs did not pull at the leash. He did not lag behind. He stayed close enough to be felt without being intrusive, a quiet constant at Mason's side. They reached the section of the trail where the trees parted slightly, opening onto a narrow clearing that allowed the sky to breathe. The bench stood there, as it always had, a simple structure of worn wood bolted into the ground, its surface smoothed by time and weather. Mason had passed it before without interest. Today it was occupied. An elderly woman sat on the bench, her posture slightly hunched but not frail, as if her body bent more from habit than weakness. She was small in stature, wrapped in a heavy coat that had once been navy blue, but had faded into something closer to gray. A knitted scarf circled her neck, practical rather than decorative, and her hands, thin, veined, steady, rested in her lap. Wisps of white hair escaped from beneath a simple wool hat, framing a face lined by years rather than hardship. Her eyes, pale and attentive, held a calm that suggested she had learned how to wait without resentment. At her feet lay a small cloth bag, open, revealing crumbs of bread. A few birds lingered nearby, hopping close and retreating again, comfortable with her presence in a way that came only from repetition. The woman scattered crumbs slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself mattered more than the result. Mason slowed without realizing it. Briggs did the same, his attention briefly shifting toward the birds before returning to Mason. The woman looked up as they approached, her gaze direct but not intrusive. She did not startle. She did not smile broadly either. She simply acknowledged them, the way one acknowledges neighbors without needing their names. "Evening," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Evening," Mason replied. His voice carried the same restraint as his posture, polite without invitation. The woman's eyes moved to Briggs. "He's a handsome one," she said, nodding slightly toward the dog. "Looks like he knows what he's doing." Briggs remained still, ears relaxed, gaze forward. Mason felt a flicker of something close to agreement. "He does," he said. It was all he offered. The woman smiled faintly, as if that answer satisfied her. "Birds don't mind him," she added, scattering another small handful of crumbs. "That's usually a good sign." Mason glanced at the birds, then back at the woman. "They seem to trust you," he said. She shrugged lightly. "I've been coming here a long time, long enough they stopped wondering what I want." The simplicity of the statement landed with more weight than she seemed to intend. Mason nodded once, accepting it without comment. He did not move to sit. He stood beside the bench, one hand resting loosely on the leash. Briggs lowered himself to the ground, settling with practiced ease, his body angled slightly toward Mason even as his eyes tracked the movement of the birds. "My name's Eleanor," the woman said after a moment. "Eleanor Finch?" "Mason," he replied. "This is Briggs." Eleanor inclined her head toward the dog, acknowledging him as if he were part of the conversation rather than an accessory to it. "Nice to meet you both," she said. Her tone suggested she meant it, but did not expect anything further. They stood there for a few moments, the forest filling the space between words. Wind moved through the trees, lifting Eleanor's scarf slightly. She adjusted it with absent familiarity. Mason noticed the way she moved, careful but not cautious, deliberate without hesitation. There was a steadiness about her that felt earned. "You're new," Eleanor said, not as a question. "Yes," Mason replied. She nodded. "This trail gets a lot of newcomers. Most don't stay long." Mason did not ask why. He suspected he already knew. "I walk it most evening," he said instead. "So do I," Eleanor replied. "Habit keeps me honest." Mason considered that. Honest about what? She smiled, small and private. "About the day ending," she said, "no matter how it went." The birds finished the last of the crumbs and fluttered away, disappearing into the trees. Eleanor folded the cloth bag and placed it beside her. She did not rise. She seemed content to remain there, watching the light thin. They spoke of small things after that. The weather, the way the forest changed with the seasons. Eleanor mentioned the frost that had come early the year before, how it caught people unprepared. Mason listened. He offered brief responses, enough to keep the exchange balanced without tipping it into something personal. Neither of them mentioned where they had come from before this place. Neither asked what the other did when not walking the trail at dusk. At one point, Eleanor gestured vaguely toward the forest. "I live just past there," she said, her hand indicating a dirt road that branched off beyond the clearing. "Little wooden house, end of the road, right before the pine stand." Mason nodded, storing the information without assigning it meaning. "Nice spot," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Quiet. That helps." The light faded another degree. Mason felt the familiar signal that it was time to turn back. He shifted his weight slightly. Briggs rose immediately, ready without command. "Well," Eleanor said, pushing herself to her feet with a practiced motion, "I should head back, too." They stood there for a moment, three figures framed by the thinning light. Eleanor adjusted her coat, then looked at Mason. "See you tomorrow," she said, as if the matter were already settled. Mason hesitated, then nodded. "Probably," he replied. Eleanor smiled, satisfied, and began walking toward the dirt road, her steps slow but steady. Mason watched until she disappeared between the trees, then turned back toward town. The trail felt subtly altered, not changed in shape or sound, but in presence. It no longer belonged solely to him and Briggs. It held the imprint of another routine, another reason to arrive at dusk. They walked home in silence. Mason did not feel lighter. He did not feel heavier either. The forest closed behind them, indifferent as ever. But something had shifted, almost imperceptibly. The path now held a point of contact, a bench, a woman who fed birds and spoke of habits. Mason carried that with him as the town lights came back into view, the day ending as it always did, quietly, without asking him to explain himself. The afternoon arrived quietly, without the clarity of sunlight or the drama of gathering rain. A thin layer of cloud dulled the sky into something colorless, and the air carried a restrained chill that lingered against the skin longer than expected. The town near the forest edge seemed to withdraw slightly, sounds fading earlier than usual, as if it too sensed that the day would not unfold in its familiar order. Mason Hale stepped onto the trail at the hour he had come to recognize as his own, guided less by intention than by the quiet structure the evenings had begun to form. He walked with the same measured pace, his posture upright but reserved, shoulders set in a way that suggested readiness rather than ease. Mason had learned long ago not to rush moments he did not fully understand. His face, composed and guarded, showed little reaction to the subtle changes in weather, but his body registered them all the same. Briggs moved beside him, the German shepherd's stride steady and controlled, his coat catching what little light filtered through the thinning branches. The dog's presence remained constant, a familiar weight against Mason's awareness. As they neared the clearing, Mason's attention sharpened without conscious command. The bench came into view gradually, its weathered wood darkened by moisture, its outline familiar against the surrounding trees. Mason slowed, then stopped. The bench was empty. No Eleanor Finch sat there with her hands folded over a cloth bag. No birds hovered nearby, hopping close and retreating again in the cautious rhythm Mason had come to associate with her presence. The clearing felt stripped of something essential, as if a small but important piece of the landscape had been quietly removed. Mason stood still, eyes moving slowly over the space, waiting for the scene to correct itself. It did not. Briggs halted beside him, ears lifting, then rotating as he took in the absence of the usual sounds. The dog's posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. This was not confusion. It was awareness. The forest itself seemed to notice the change, its background rhythm muted, leaves and branches holding their breath in a way Mason could not quite explain. Mason waited longer than he needed to. Habit told him that routines bent, that people arrived late or not at all for reasons that required no intervention. Eleanor had never promised to be there. Still, the emptiness pressed at him with a persistence that refused to dissolve. It was not fear. It was not urgency. It was a quiet imbalance, the sense that something expected had failed to arrive. He resumed walking, passing the bench and continuing down the trail, boots striking the boards in a steady cadence. Briggs followed closely, his pace slightly slower than usual, as if recalibrating to a new set of conditions. Mason focused on the path ahead, on the curve of the trail as it narrowed and widened, on the forest closing in and pulling back again. He told himself the moment would pass. After several minutes, it did not. The unease returned, more defined now, no longer content to remain at the edges of his awareness. Mason slowed, then stopped, breath shallow but controlled. The forest around him remained unchanged. The trail ahead offered no explanation. And yet, something felt unfinished. Mason turned back. Briggs pivoted immediately, his body aligning with Mason's movement, his ears now angled forward. The dog did not resist the change in direction. He accepted it without hesitation, trust evident in the smoothness of the turn. They retraced their steps toward the clearing, the sound of their return softened by damp wood and fallen needles. The bench was still empty. Mason stood there again, longer this time, taking in details he had ignored before. The grain of the wood, worn smooth by years of use, the faint marks left by weather and time. This bench had become more than a place to sit. It had become a marker, a point in the day where something steady had begun to form. Without Eleanor, it felt incomplete, like a sentence left without its ending. Mason's gaze drifted beyond the clearing, toward the forest edge where the trail thinned and a narrow dirt road branched away, nearly hidden beneath brush and low-hanging limbs. He remembered Eleanor's voice from the previous evening, the way she had mentioned it casually, without emphasis. A little wooden house, end of the road, right before the pine stand. The memory surfaced without urgency, but it did not fade. He remained where he was, weighing the boundary he had set for himself when he chose this town. Distance had been intentional. Solitude had been necessary. He had selected places that asked nothing of him, routines that did not demand engagement. Turning onto that dirt road felt like a departure from that plan, a quiet shift toward involvement he had not prepared for. Briggs adjusted his stance beside him, paws settling more firmly into the damp ground. The dog's pace had slowed, his posture now more guarded, though not tense. His attention fixed on the dirt road, ears forward, body ready. Briggs was not alarmed. He was cautious. The distinction mattered. Mason exhaled slowly. The decision did not arrive as a dramatic moment of resolve. It formed the way many decisions did, shaped by the refusal of the unease to dissipate. Ignoring it would not restore the rhythm of the walk. It would only follow him home, unspoken and unresolved. "All right," Mason said quietly. They turned off the trail and onto the dirt road. The ground changed beneath Mason's boots, packed earth replacing wood, pine needles softening the sound of each step. The forest pressed closer here, branches arching overhead, filtering the remaining light into uneven patches that shifted as clouds moved across the sky. Mason's awareness sharpened, not into tension, but into focus. He noted the incline of the road, the way it curved rather than cut straight through the trees. This was not a path meant for haste. Briggs walked more slowly now, his steps deliberate, head lowered slightly as he tracked the ground ahead. His body language was restrained, alert, without agitation. Mason matched the dog's pace without thinking, adjusting instinctively. He was aware of his breath again, of how shallow it remained, but he did not force it deeper. He simply allowed it to be. They moved farther from the trail, the clearing and the empty bench slipping behind them. The forest closed in with patient certainty, the dirt road drawing them forward. Mason did not look back. The unease that had begun at the bench no longer asked him to stop. It had shifted into something quieter, something that felt like preparation. The afternoon darkened toward dusk as Mason and Briggs continued on, the dirt road accepting each step without resistance, leading them deeper into the trees and toward whatever waited beyond the bend. The dirt road narrowed as it curved deeper into the forest, the light thinning with each step Mason Hale took. Dusk settled into a muted gray-blue, the kind that softened edges without hiding them. The trees pressed closer here, their trunks standing like quiet sentries, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. When the house finally appeared, it did so without announcement, a small wooden structure set back from the road as if it preferred to remain unnoticed. The house was modest and weathered, its wooden siding faded but intact, bearing the marks of years rather than neglect. A narrow porch stretched across the front, boards worn smooth by time. No lights glowed behind the windows, no sound carried from inside. Mason slowed at the edge of the yard, his posture shifting from movement to assessment, every detail registering with the practiced attention of someone trained to notice what others overlooked. Briggs moved differently now. The German shepherd's pace shortened, his steps deliberate, his head lifting slightly as he tested the air. His ears angled forward, then shifted again, measuring the stillness. Age had tempered his movements, but not dulled them. His black and tan coat, thick and weather-worn, absorbed the fading light, the gray threading through it more visible at dusk. He stayed close to Mason, neither pulling nor hesitating, his presence steady and contained. Mason stood for a moment longer than necessary, letting the house reveal itself without forcing meaning onto it. A chair sat near the porch wall, angled neatly as if placed with care. There were no signs of haste, no disorder that suggested panic or abandonment. And yet, the unease that had followed Mason from the empty bench did not ease. It sharpened, quietly but insistently. "Eleanor," Mason called, his voice carrying toward the porch. He waited, listening past the echo of his own words. The forest answered with the soft shifting of leaves, the distant settling of birds. No human voice replied. He stepped closer and called again, louder this time. "Eleanor Finch." Silence. Briggs advanced a half step, then stopped, body angled toward the door. His posture was alert but controlled, readiness without alarm. Mason reached the porch and noticed then that the front door was not fully closed. It rested against the frame with a narrow gap, just enough to catch what little light remained. Mason paused. He had not come here to intrude. He had come because absence sometimes meant more than presence, and ignoring it had never been his strength. He pushed the door open gently. The house greeted him with stillness. The air inside held the faint scent of wood and something older, paper perhaps, or time. The entry opened into a small living space, sparse but carefully kept. A simple table stood near the center, its surface mostly clear. Mason remained at the threshold, scanning without searching, taking in what the space offered willingly. "Hello," he said, more announcement than greeting. No answer came. He stepped inside, just far enough for the floorboards to register his weight with a muted creak. The walls were plain, the furnishings few. A small bookshelf lined one side of the room, its contents arranged neatly, spines worn but respected. Everything spoke of routine, of intention, of a life organized to avoid excess. Briggs followed him just inside the doorway, then stopped. The dog sat, back straight, gaze steady, holding position as if guarding the line between inside and out. Mason noticed and trusted the restraint. His eyes returned to the table. A small wooden box sat near the edge, its lid not fully closed. The wood was dark and smooth, polished by years of handling. Mason did not move toward it at first. He stood still, allowing the room to settle around him, allowing the unease to take shape without rushing it. Then he stepped closer. He did not open the box. He did not touch it. Through the narrow opening, he could see the dull edge of a metal chain. Just a corner, barely visible. Beneath it, the unmistakable edge of a military identification tag. Mason froze. The room did not change. The house did not react. The forest outside remained indifferent. But something inside Mason stopped moving forward, caught in a moment that did not yet have words. He stared at the exposed corner of the tag, his breath shallow and still, the weight of recognition pressing quietly against his chest. The house did not react to Mason Hale's stillness. It remained exactly as it had been moments before, quiet and orderly, the air unmoved by the weight that had suddenly settled into his chest. The small wooden box sat on the table, its lid still slightly open, the corner of the military identification tag visible enough to be undeniable. Mason did not reach for it. He did not need confirmation. Recognition had already begun its slow, irreversible work. His breath came shallow, then stalled altogether, as if his body were waiting for instruction that never arrived. The years between this room and the place where he had last seen that metal glint collapsed inward. Sound faded first, then depth. The room narrowed until there was only the table, the box, and the photograph resting beside it, face down, edges worn soft by time and touch. Mason reached for the photograph. His hand moved with care, fingers steady despite the tension running through his arm. He did not rush the motion. He did not hesitate either. There was no drama in it, no sudden pull of courage or collapse of restraint. It felt procedural, the way movements did when instinct overrode thought. He lifted the photograph and turned it over. He did not need a name. He did not need an explanation. The face looked back at him from another time, another world. Younger, leaner. The eyes held the same focused calm Mason had once seen reflected in steel and glass, the kind that existed only in people who knew exactly where danger lived and chose to step toward it anyway. The jaw was familiar, the faint crease near the mouth, the expression caught somewhere between seriousness and something almost kind. The room shifted. Mason's knees weakened, not suddenly, but in stages, as if his body were negotiating with gravity and losing ground inch by inch. He reached out blindly and caught the edge of the table, fingers tightening around the wood until sensation returned in sharp pulses. His breath broke free in a harsh exhale that sounded too loud in the stillness. The photograph did not move. It held its position, its truth unyielding. That face had been above him once, framed by smoke and chaos, bent close enough that Mason had registered detail even as blood filled his vision. He remembered the grit between his teeth, the weight pressing down on his chest, the moment his world had narrowed to sound and pain. He remembered the hand that had found his harness, fingers locking in with certainty, hauling him backward through a space that had no right to open. He remembered the voice, not the words, but the steadiness of it. He remembered being pulled free. Mason did not remember screaming. He remembered silence afterward, the kind that followed extraction, the kind that came when one life continued and another did not. His grip on the table tightened. The memory did not arrive as a flood. It came in fragments, precise and merciless. A shoulder blocking fire, a body shifting weight to shield him. The last glance back that Mason had not been able to return. The photograph trembled slightly in his hand. He lowered it to the table, careful not to damage it, as if respect still mattered even now. His legs refused to support him fully. He slid down slowly, controlled, until one knee met the floor, then the other. The movement cost him more effort than it should have. The house remained silent, bearing witness without commentary. Behind him, Briggs sat. The German shepherd had not moved from his position near the doorway. He had not approached the table. He had not whined or barked. He sat with his back straight, head lifted, eyes fixed not on the photograph, but on Mason. Briggs's posture was no longer casual. It was formal, almost ceremonial, the way it had been when waiting for commands that never came lightly. His ears were forward. His breathing was slow and measured. Mason noticed him distantly, the awareness threading through the heavier realization like a thin line of light. He reached out and rested his hand briefly against the floor, grounding himself in the texture of wood and dust. His other hand remained on the table, fingers curled near the photograph without touching it again. He tried to stand. The attempt failed before it fully began. His muscles did not respond in the sequence he expected. Strength, usually so reliable in its absence or presence, betrayed him now by existing without coordination. He stayed where he was, half kneeling, half collapsed, breath coming in uneven pulls. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. This was not discovery. It was collision. Mason's mind reached instinctively for distance, for compartmentalization, the skills he had relied on to survive before and after the moment captured in the photograph. They did not engage. The image resisted storage. It refused to be filed away as information. It demanded recognition as fact. He had lived because this man had stepped forward. He had walked out because this man had not. Mason's throat tightened, the sensation unfamiliar in its intensity. He swallowed once, then again, each movement deliberate. The house did not offer comfort. It did not need to. Its quiet was absolute, leaving Mason alone with what he now knew without language, softening the impact. Briggs shifted slightly, adjusting his position without rising. His tail remained still. His gaze did not waver. The dog's presence was not consolation. It was confirmation. Mason was not alone, but this was something only he could carry. He forced another breath, deeper this time, pulling air into his chest with conscious effort. The action hurt, not physically, but in the way that expansion did after being held too long. His vision blurred briefly, then steadied. He closed his eyes, not to escape the image, but to anchor himself against it. When he opened them again, the photograph was still there. Mason did not pick it up a second time. He did not look for additional details. He did not search the room for context or answers. None of that belonged to this moment. This moment was complete in itself. Slowly, with care that bordered on reverence, Mason pushed himself upright just enough to lean back against the table. His legs trembled, then held. He did not fully stand. He did not sit. He remained caught between positions, between states, as if his body mirrored the space his mind now occupied. The house near the trees held its silence. Outside, the forest continued its evening routine, indifferent to the fracture that had just occurred within its boundary. Time did not pause. Light did not shift in response. Mason rested his forehead briefly against the edge of the table, eyes closed, breath shallow but steady. The image burned behind his eyelids, unaltered by darkness. He did not say the man's name. He did not need to. The next afternoon carried a colder light, sharper at the edges, as if the sun itself were less willing to soften what it revealed. Clouds thinned high above the town, letting pale brightness fall cleanly onto rooftops and empty streets. The forest stood unchanged, tall and patient, its presence neither welcoming nor hostile. Mason Hale arrived at the clearing earlier than usual and stopped beside the bench, not because he needed time, but because time no longer waited for him. He stood instead of sitting. His posture was rigid, held together by discipline rather than ease. Mason looked much as he always had to an outside eye. Tall, lean, controlled, dressed for function rather than comfort. But the strain beneath the surface had sharpened. His jaw remained set, his gaze fixed ahead, not on the path, but on the space where Eleanor Finch usually appeared. He did not pace. He did not rehearse. He simply waited, breath measured, hands relaxed only by force of will. Briggs sat beside him, the German shepherd's body aligned with Mason's stance, ears alert, eyes tracking the forest edge. Age had given Briggs patience rather than slowness. His movements were economical, his attention deliberate. He understood waiting, he understood thresholds. His presence was quiet but unmistakable, a steady weight against the instability Mason carried. The bench remained empty for a long moment. Then footsteps reached them, slow and even, the sound carried softly through fallen leaves. Eleanor Finch emerged from the trees, her figure small against the vertical lines of trunks and branches. She wore her familiar coat, heavy and worn at the cuffs, and the same scarf wrapped carefully around her neck. Her white hair was tucked beneath a knitted hat, and her posture leaned slightly forward, shaped by years rather than weakness. She walked with care but not hesitation, her steps measured, practiced. When she saw Mason standing there, she slowed. Her eyes moved from his face to the bench, then to Briggs, taking in the arrangement without comment. She did not smile. She did not ask why he was waiting. She approached the bench and rested one hand on the wood, as if grounding herself in its presence before sitting. Mason waited until she settled before speaking. "I went looking for you," he said. Eleanor nodded once, acknowledging the statement without inviting explanation. She folded her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced, posture composed. "You weren't here," Mason continued. His voice was steady, stripped of emphasis. "I followed the road you mentioned." Eleanor did not react. Her gaze remained on Mason, attentive but unreadable. "I didn't go far," he said. "I wasn't sure I should." She inclined her head slightly, not agreement, not refusal. Simply listening. Mason drew a breath, deeper than the others he had taken that day. The air felt tight in his chest, resistant, as if his body remembered the cost of speaking certain truths aloud. He did not soften his words. He did not search for gentler ones. "I saw your son," he said. The forest remained still. The bench did not creak. Eleanor did not move. "I didn't know who he was at first," Mason went on. "Not until I saw the photograph. Not until it was too late to look away." Eleanor's eyes did not leave his face. Her expression did not shift. Only her breathing changed slightly, slower now, more deliberate. "I served with him," Mason said. "We were on the same mission." He paused, not for effect, but because his body demanded it. Briggs remained seated, gaze fixed on Mason, posture formal and contained. "It went wrong," Mason continued. "The kind of wrong you don't fix by moving faster." Eleanor's hands tightened briefly, then relaxed again. She said nothing. "I was hit," Mason said. "Pinned. I couldn't clear the position on my own." He swallowed once, the movement controlled but visible. "He came back for me." The words settled into the space between them, heavy and exact. Mason did not look away. "He didn't hesitate," he said. "He didn't call it in. He didn't wait for cover. He stepped in front of me." Mason's voice did not break. It flattened, as if carrying weight required removing inflection altogether. "He pulled me out," he said. "He got me clear." The forest breathed around them, leaves shifting faintly, a distant bird calling once before falling silent again. "He didn't make it back," Mason said. "I did." He did not apologize. He did not say he was sorry. He did not ask for understanding or mercy or absolution. He stated the facts as they existed, unchanged by time. "I didn't know who he was to you," Mason said, "not until yesterday." Eleanor remained still. Her face held no visible reaction, no release, no collapse. She absorbed his words with the same steadiness she had carried into the clearing. "I didn't come to explain myself," Mason said. "I didn't come to ask you for anything." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I came because the truth didn't belong to me alone anymore." Eleanor breathed in slowly. The motion was subtle but deliberate. She exhaled just as carefully. Her eyes lowered for a brief moment, then returned to Mason's face. She did not speak. The bench held them both, one seated, one standing. Briggs remained motionless, a quiet sentinel between them. Minutes passed without interruption. The light shifted slightly, sliding across the clearing as the afternoon moved toward evening. Eleanor did not respond. She did not ask questions. She did not confirm or deny anything Mason had said. She listened. At last, Mason felt the weight of having spoken settle fully into his body. It did not lift. It did not crush him. It simply existed, complete. "I'll be here," he said quietly, not as a promise, as a fact. Eleanor nodded once. She did not speak. The days that followed did not rush toward resolution. They unfolded with a steadiness that felt earned, each afternoon arriving with the same quiet negotiation between light and shadow. The town near the forest settled into late autumn, roofs dulled by mist, windows catching the last of the sun like held breath. Mason Hale came to the trail again, not because it demanded him, but because it welcomed what he carried now. The bench waited where it always had, its worn boards familiar, its presence no longer provisional. Eleanor Finch arrived a few minutes later, walking with the same measured pace she had always kept. She looked smaller beside the trees, wrapped in her coat and scarf, white hair tucked beneath her hat, but there was nothing diminished in the way she moved. Her posture carried a steadiness that came from having chosen how to stand after loss rather than being bent by it. She greeted Mason with a nod, then turned her gaze toward the clearing as if checking that the place itself remained intact. "I've been thinking," she said, settling onto the bench. Her voice was calm, neither tentative nor firm, simply certain of being heard. "About what you told me." Mason stood nearby, hands relaxed at his sides. Briggs sat between them, his body angled toward Eleanor now, as easily as it once had been toward Mason alone. The German shepherd's age showed most clearly in his patience. He did not shift or fidget. He simply existed where he was needed, amber eyes attentive, breath slow and even. "My son chose," Eleanor continued. "That matters to me. He didn't stumble into it. He didn't hesitate. He chose to save someone else." She paused, looking out toward the trees where the trail narrowed. "And I choose not to let that end in silence." Mason nodded once. He did not respond with gratitude or apology. He understood that this was not an exchange. It was a declaration. They began with the trail. The path had weathered years of use and neglect in equal measure. Boards had warped, nails had worked loose, moss crept along the edges where damp lingered longest. Mason brought tools from his house the next day, practical and well-kept, the kind he favored because they did not ask for explanation. Eleanor watched from the bench at first, hands folded, offering commentary only when necessary. She knew the trail as someone knows a place by repetition rather than design. She pointed out spots that flooded after rain, places where roots pushed up from beneath the boards, sections that grew slick when frost came early. Mason listened. He worked with the same economy that had once defined his movements in another context, but without urgency now. Each board was tested, lifted, reset. He replaced what could not be saved, reinforced what could. The work was physical and precise, and in that precision he found a rhythm that did not pull him backward. Briggs followed at a respectful distance, sitting when Mason knelt, standing when Mason stood, his presence constant but unobtrusive. Others noticed eventually. A man from town stopped by one afternoon, tall and broad, with a beard gone gray at the edges and hands marked by labor. His name was Thomas Reed, a carpenter who had lived near the forest long enough to remember when the trail was first laid. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were practical and offered without expectation. He brought spare boards, measured Mason's work with a critical eye, then nodded once in approval before lending his hands. He did not ask questions. He did not stay long. His contribution fit the place the way Eleanor's had, quiet and sufficient. The bench came last. It was Eleanor who suggested it, gesturing toward the spot she favored, where the light lingered a few moments longer than elsewhere. Mason considered the ground, the angle of the sun, the way the forest opened just enough there to feel held rather than exposed. Together they chose wood that would weather honestly, neither polished nor treated beyond necessity. Thomas returned with bolts and tools, his movements efficient, his presence steady. The bench took shape slowly, deliberately, each piece fitted with care. When it was finished, Eleanor ran her hand along the smooth edge, testing it. She smiled then, not broadly, but with a satisfaction that reached her eyes. "He would have liked this," she said, not as a comparison, but as a statement of fact. Mason felt something settle in his chest, not relief, but alignment. From that day on, the afternoons found their shape again. Mason arrived at the trail with Briggs as the light began to soften. Eleanor joined them with her cloth bag, scattering crumbs for the birds that returned gradually, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. They walked together, not always side by side, sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes with Eleanor speaking of small things. She told stories of the town as it used to be, of winters that taught patience, of neighbors who understood the value of showing up without spectacle. Mason listened, offering the occasional comment, the occasional smile that surprised him with its ease. Briggs adapted to the new formation without effort. He positioned himself where the ground narrowed, slowed when Eleanor's steps did, paused when the birds gathered too close. His loyalty had not changed, it had expanded. Age had given him discernment, the ability to include without dividing his attention. The trail became more than a route, it became a practice. There were evenings when the forest felt heavier, when memories pressed closer than Mason preferred. On those days, Eleanor did not ask questions. She adjusted her pace to his, spoke less, allowed the quiet to do its work. Mason learned to recognize when she needed the same. He learned that presence did not require explanation to be meaningful. As autumn gave way to the first hints of winter, the light changed. Hoarfrost gathered along the edges of the boards in the early hours, melting by afternoon. The bench held the cold and released it slowly. Mason found himself sitting beside Eleanor more often, the two of them watching the sun lower itself behind the trees. The ending of the day no longer felt like an extraction. It felt like closure. One evening, as the sky burned briefly with color before dimming, Eleanor spoke again. "You didn't just carry the truth back," she said. "You stayed." Mason considered that. "I didn't know how not to," he replied. She nodded, satisfied. That's usually how it works. The forest accepted them as it always had, indifferent and enduring. The town lights flickered on at the same hour each evening, marking time without commentary. Mason felt the continuity of it settle into his bones. He was not cured, he was not absolved, but he was present, and presence had proven to be enough. When the sun finally slipped away, leaving the clearing in blue shadow, Mason rose and offered Eleanor his arm. She took it without hesitation, her grip firm, her balance sure. Briggs stood and fell into step beside them, his tail swaying once, controlled and content. They walked back toward town together, the path firm beneath their feet, the bench behind them holding the warmth of the day. Tomorrow would come. It always did. But now it would arrive to something waiting. Mason understood that at last. He was no longer only the man who survived. He was the one who continued. Many of us walk through life carrying unseen wounds. Some were saved by someone else's sacrifice. Some survived when others did not. And often we ask the same question in our hearts. Why me? Faith does not always give us an answer, but God often gives us something else. A path, a responsibility, a chance to live in a way that honors what was given to us. The Bible tells us that greater love has no one than this, that someone lays down their life for another. That kind of love does not disappear. It becomes a calling. If you are still here today, breathing, watching this story, then your life still has purpose. Not because you are perfect, but because you are present. Maybe your miracle is not behind you. Maybe it is what you choose to do next. How you forgive, how you speak the truth, how you show up for others, how you keep walking when the sun goes down. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story made you feel. And if you believe, type Amen in the comments as a prayer for those who carried others, for those who were carried, and for those still learning how to breathe again. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel so more stories of faith, love, and quiet courage can reach the people who need them. May God bless you. May God protect those you love. And may the path ahead of you be filled with meaning, even in silence.